And Tewa, was just before we started the discussion to say that I was very pleased to engage with your work, and I'm very excited for the discussion. It was definitely a lot of layers, a lot to get interested in. So yeah, I'm very happy that we'll be able to start some discussions and ask you some questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. I prepared notes from the film to read with.
Yeah, I received your email, so I think you can go ahead with this when everyone gets back, and then from there we can. I prepared some points. Maybe we can offer them to the public also to talk about your creative process, about some of our themes, and if you it's the goal is to allow you also to share what you want to share. But I went through your notes, and you will follow with this.
Okay, thank you so much. Exciting. I will start with a screen share until everyone is prepared. Yeah. Is it sharing? All is good.
Yeah, it's.
Okay.
I think we can maybe start in. People, because it's 35. People can.
Okay. We can begin. Sorry, I apologize that my camera is not working for some reason, so I'll only join you through voice and slides and imagery.
So I had a similar problem, and I realized afterwards that it is my antivirus.
That might be it.
It makes like firewall, and it stops certain things in the computer. So I've been like disabling it constantly since the morning in order to be able to be with you. So yeah.
Okay, I'll try to do so after the meeting then.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. I think I'll begin. So thank you everyone for watching. The Insurgence of Ghibli Winds is the first chapter in the Warlap trilogy, a series of experimental docu-fiction film essays that interlace multiple layers of military history and ongoing mechanisms of warfare, entangled with questions around fiction, space, time, gamification, and fascist desires. As you've seen, the film unfolds across 4 scenes: the first bombs, the testimony, the insurgence of Ghibli, and a dialogue between Ghibli and Caproni. Aerial warfare and the vertical gaze are departure points in my research. The film opens with a voice-over in a Tripolitanian English accent, reciting a letter written by the Italian lieutenant Giulio Gavotti to his father, following the first military airstrikes from a Taube monoplane on a field hospital near Ain Zara Oasis in 1911. This event had signaled the emergence of aerial warfare and foreshadowed mechanisms of intimidation and bombardment in all wars to come. Arab and African bodies were and still are the test subject to that historical continuum of early military progress. The structure and spatial logic of Italian colonization was that of mass extermination, settler colonial urban planning, and agricultural modification of the land's ecological ecosystem, mass disposition of the native population in concentration camps, and kidnapping and exile of thousands of Libyans into labor camps in several Italian islands. What I'm showing are paintings and depictions of that same event, and also archival imagery of the first designs of the aircraft. The testimony of Saleh al-Jiyash in the second scene, a survivor of a Magroon concentration camp in eastern Libya, is an example of testimonies that outlive erasure. He describes the conditions in which the resistance operated under. The mountainous terrain against the unfamiliar alien technology, the steadfastness and longing to liberate the lands against the siege designed by the closing of the Egyptian-Libyan border by barbed wires of 2 meters depth and 6 meters tall across the vast desert between Marsa Matruh and Saloum. In Genocide in Libya, Shar, Hidden Colonial Evil, a book by Ali Abdel Latif Hameda, published in 2022, we learned that the term Shar is used commonly by the survivors of the genocide. الشر قتلني, I was killed by Shar. It doesn't only refer to Shar as evil, but also to the starvation and engineered famine that people endured during their encampment across 16 concentration camps in the eastern region of Libya, where the intent was to exterminate the population and defeat the Senussi resistance movement. Through the oral testimony of Libyan survivors and Hameda's analysis, artists and researchers are bound to face an inevitable truth. We are not only tracing the erasure, but the erasure of the erasure systematic events. This investigation of the genocide uncovers the obscure history of the fascist Italian concentration camps in the years 1929 to 1934. But it also connects the Libyan genocide to the colonial roots of the Holocaust and the manipulation of genocidal studies. The testimonies gathered by Hameda shows that despite the efforts deployed by Italy to manipulate and move on from a dark and gruesome history, the concentration camps are a living and continuous testimony, a fascist future of a time set in advance, and the foreshore as the space where that ideology is engineered and tested. In 2025, last year, I spent days in Tripoli studying at the Mujahideen Center of Archives and Historical Studies. In the early 1970s, the center began a field campaign all over cities, towns, and villages across West, East, and South Libya in order to establish the Department of Oral Narration, شعبة الرواية الشفهية, where an audio archive of testimonies was created in the years after through nation-scale efforts. It contained interviews, poetry, songs, and elders narrating memories of their loved ones or that of battle, famine, exile, displacements, and the resistance against the infrastructures instrumentalized by the fascist regime. While I was going through the index of around 7,000 recordings, I came to the realization that there is not a single video archive in that 5-floor building. The main moving image, film, or media that circulated inside Libya was the film Lion of the Desert, commissioned by Gaddafi and directed by Al-Aqad. Although the film is significant in offering a historical narration about Italian colonization in Libya and the role of the resistance, it has often been instrumentalized by the regime in Libya to serve ideological theatrics of the state, while erasing the long history of the Senussi movement that is rooted in the land, religious practices, and collective generational resistance beyond the figure of Omar al-Mukhtar as the sole leader of that movement. In this case, the glorification of the hero distracts us from learning the pedagogies that were taught by Sufi freedom fighters across the Zawaya and other forms of resisting, returning, and being. In the film, I use sequences from the line of the desert, layered, manipulated, and paired with aerial footage from the Italian archives, or what I can at least gain access to, with time, tempo, textures, song, and symbolisms being considered crucial in guiding the editing process, blurring the threshold between the image that is staged and that which is captured. One song I wrote and chanted within the film is for those who felt the Ghibli winds. هؤلاء الذين جاوروا ريح القبلي. Ghibli is an indigenous Libyan wind that carries the Sahara grains towards the Qibla and back, a wind with planetary ecological role beyond the African continent. The Italian aircraft design being named after the Ghibli wind does not come as a surprise. Libyans prayed to be saved by the winds and that heat waves will blind the colonizers. European and American colonizers often fetishized intangible beings, the more than human species, claimed it, instrumentalized it, celebrated it in the name of genocidal success across colonies of the world. In this case, Ghibli was the red angry winds that Italians were trying to manufacture in their engineering of desire and domination through wheels and wings, through seas and skies. The Ghibli aircraft, designed by aeronautical engineer Giovanni Caproni, was crucial in the domination of the Italian colonies. It was also sold as a game toy and a collectible item across Italy to celebrate the Italian fascist technological progress. A museum and a monument in his name still stands in the Trento region of northern Italy today. On the other hand, when the Japanese Miyazaki was asked why he chose the name Ghibli for Studio Ghibli animations, he did not once mention the wind. He mentioned the aircraft and his love for aviation technology. He even goes further to portray the engineer Giovanni Caproni in his film The Wind Rises from 2013, which I inserted in the film, depicted as the visitor in a dream of the main child character, Gio, confirming that airplanes had always been a colonial dream and a colonial instrument. The question that haunts me most in my practice in relation to spatial dynamics of domination within the Italian colonial continuum is not only the conditions of historicity, but the absent question about its continuous present and future. Addressing Italian colonial amnesia is crucial in understanding the positioning of Libyan colonial reality and systematic isolation within Africa and the Arab world. The brutality of the fascist regime of Mussolini and all the operations of militarization that are now manifested in an architecture that keeps renewing itself in various forms and infrastructures. In these times, by proxy, or by local proxy, what used to be a concentration camp is now disguised as a neo-colonial industry of detention centers where Black migrants are put into inhumane detention, torture, and slavery, scattered across all coastal cities in Libya and further hidden into the desert. The dialogue of the film's last scene unfolds against the backdrop of visual regime of war games and found footage from air combat between Libyan and American fighters. Tracing the temporal path of imperial vertical power in the Libyan landscape leads to acts of geographic defiance against the American imperialism between 1980s and 1990s, which set the tone for the war on terror propaganda and put Libya into years and years of international sanctions, isolation, and otherness. Navigated in the film through military archival footage and early computer graphics from the American game F-16 stealth flight that was released in 1988, 2 years after the US bombed Tripoli and the residence of Gaddafi in Bab el-Aziziyah. The pilot leads a mission to destroy an imagined nuclear plant in the Gulf of Sirte by the central Libyan coast. Military games normalizes colonial violence through interfaces of play, aerial asymmetrical systems of targeting, infrastructural destruction, and capturing missions. The operational tactics and choreographical staging of geographies to be dehumanized and populations to be disposed of and dominated, from Palestine to Libya to Iraq and beyond, the ideological load carried by the technical, perceptual mechanisms of asymmetricality is rooted in that same bombing executed by the Italian bomb pilot in 1911. As he states, the Arab tents being at his line of vision announces the successful targeting and celebration of his historical mission. To conduct the notes, I end with a quote from Haytham al-Wardani's text, Labor of Listening. What is buried deep in everything I hear are not whispers of some ghosts, but the unvoiced longing toward a truer world. Thank you.
Very much, Tewa, for this very rich reflection. Brilliant, really. I'm gonna hand it over to Emma, who has the mission of engaging thoughtfully with this. So to you, Emma. Emma,
Yeah,
I can introduce you as well. So
page.
okay, so Emma is an undergraduate student in political sciences at Sciences Po Paris and philosophy at Sorbonne University, currently studying at the American University in Cairo. Through her experiences, she explores notions of being in cities, politics, poetics, and commitments to decolonizing practices. Through an internship in third space, Shakire, is it right?
Yeah.
She critically engaged with questions of participation and integration of publics in the Western city through work and community engagement. Moreover, as the founding member of the Collective, she focuses on bringing these visions to life through dialogue, culture, and exploration of themes such as resistance, resilience, and subaltern struggles. I'm just smiling because Emma will judge me later on for all.
For your introduction.
Yeah, I have the honor that Emma is also one of my students. She's been with us in a year of brilliance, really. So, to you, Emma.
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited to be starting this discussion, and I think I thank you for sharing your notes and for sharing this further discussion on the themes in the movies, which I think can allow for. Well, you gave us a lot, but I think I will try, and then of course the idea is for us to also discuss, but to maybe talk a bit more on some themes, and then maybe on your creative process in itself. So I think the first point I would like for you to maybe further reflect on is, for me, what I felt from all this that you shared is this question of imaginations. So I think we can. So first, there is the idea of the wind and how you manage to bring this reflection on how it's at the same time a representation of a form of soul of that we can link back, of course, to Sufi thoughts, and how it also reflects maybe a will of a resistance, but how it's also fetishized and recuperated by a colonial imagination. So in the context of naming the airplanes. And at the same time, there is this idea, and you shared with the last quote, of maybe this haunting of the past, but at the same time of the future that is not, because it has been stolen. So in the context of Libya and in the context of course, other geographies. And so, yeah, on this reflection on of course aesthetics, but on this imaginations, I wanted to maybe talk for you to talk a bit more about how you see yourself in this in your creative process. How do you deal with this dynamics in a way? So you talked a bit about editing, about how you also conceive this work as like multiple layers with different formats, and also on the importance of oral testimonies out of recuperation, whether we see here with the colonial power, but you also mentioned briefly how like there was maybe a void concerning on videos on this archives on the Libyan side also. So yeah, I don't know if this is maybe giving you some things you want to reflect on this question of so imaginations of your creative process and how to deal with at the same time what has been stolen and what is we don't even know has been stolen, but is also yeah. So I don't know if you want to expand on this. Nice.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, I think a lot of the work is about the imagination and the politics of desire, manufacturing of the fascist dream. I mention a lot the term foreshore, and this is what Italy used to use a lot in describing Libya as the foreshore of Italy. And although in official terms Italian colonization ended, but you know, Meloni still uses this term in recent politics, and the dynamics are still very much present, for example. So I think it's interesting for me to explore this idea of the Fort Shore as a site of a colonial imagination that was created from the 1911 onwards. The wind itself being fetishized and you know, foreign to the Italian idea of the land, and being this immense force that comes and disrupts the flow of their operation, their military operation. I mentioned how it always comes back in the poetry. It's also considered something very sacred. And I think when it comes to the land and people of the land, then there is always some sort of like harmony, even with the harshness of this wind, whether in the past or present. While I think for Italians it was something to be untamed, it's something untamed and has to be controlled or also manufactured as a simple. I think in my work in general, I trace a lot of different elements of different beings and species that are weaponized by colonialism and revived or used as an emblem or a symbol of the fascist regime, or several depictions of imperial power. And this is one example. And I think if we go further towards understanding the wind on a planetary scale, it is not only about what the wind represents, but I think not only from Italy, but if you see the history of colonial progress and colonial technology, the wind were always instrumentalized to cross the Atlantic, for example, to accelerate the speed in which colonialism manufactured that so-called progress and science and further on. So the wind comes as also by the end as this entity that claims that asks for accountability and addresses the colonial amnesia. but also with the dialogue between the wind and Caproni, you can see as well that Caproni, from his place and somewhere in a limbo or in some afterlife, is kind of escaping the conversation and hiding away from that accountability, which is also the conversation that often happens around Italian colonization in Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. So this kind of dialogue, or like trial, if you want to, we can call it a trial, is something that where I also, when I show the film, it's something being performed live. So maybe you've noticed that the voice of Caproni is there, but in the screenings I did recently, I would be reading the parts or performing the parts where Ghibli is speaking. And somehow it, of course, from like an artistic aspect, it blurs the idea of who's narrating and when and where, and all these ideas around the timeline, because it starts with 1911, but goes into the 1980s and 2011. And there's always this cycle of history that kind of that is present in the work, where it starts somewhere as a departure point, but then it returns to it again. The first bombings that the film begins with, I end with it in the notes because I was finding a lot of articles from 2011 when the NATO bombed Libya, and they would refer to the bombing of NATO as the celebration or the anniversary of the 100-year from that first bombing. So it's never only something that is stuck in the past or manipulated in terms of only historicity, but it's a continuous cycle that kind of manifests itself again and again through different game players, factors, infrastructures, proxies, and so on. Yes.
I thank you so much. Yeah, and I think that's. I'm glad you mentioned it, because I wanted to ask you also about this part. You said how you were performing this dialogue, and I think this is also the question of a performance, even in this movie, as you said, you wrote and you performed the song. So I wanted to ask you a bit about this practice of a recitation, and also practice of recitation and practice of performance. How do you envision it? Is it like something that you consider also as a form of not necessarily healing, but how do you place this notion of recitation, of performance, of the body, the voice, that I think you still mentioned, that you mentioned on different occasions? Is it central to your work? How would you expand on that?
Yes, as I mentioned in the text when I was talking about the archives, for example, and the absence of media and film archive. When I was working at the archive center, for example, a lot of the oral, like there was big and huge efforts to document oral testimonies, because a lot of the evidences of the Libyan genocide and the way also knowledge is transmitted within Libyan society is dominantly oral. It's through songs, through rituals, gatherings, poetry, and especially in Eastern Libya, where a lot of the poems that I have been working on in my past projects were recited. They begin with being recited and later on transmitted in the form of songs and then translated, transcribed, and documented. But the recitation is very core theme that, of course, like I practice, I embody in my practice as well. With the Ghibli chant in the film, I actually wrote this in Amsterdam with Sari, who's joining us here. We were corresponding and trying to do this exercise to write together in one notebook. And I was working on the film at the time. So a lot of the thoughts came through the framework of thinking through the Ghibli wind, around the Ghibli wind, and what does it mean to live by such an intangible force and the knowledge that it can transmit. In terms of the oralities and how they're channeled and transmitted, there's of course this constant battling between what is considered an evidence and what is considered a native's version of the truth. And I face this a lot within, like, working with Western institutions and so on. While our history is very much transmitted through voice and vocalities and rhythms, it is still considered in a way unvalid enough or unoriginal enough, since there is an absence of image, categorization, and classifications, which I think what the importance of working with oral histories and oral literature kind of, rebels against in this case. The idea of a very transmitted practice, inherited, generational, and that is only research-based and based mostly on the data and the numbers and imagery that is collected by, most of the time, Western institutions. And there's a duality there, of course, because I also talk about how the Libyan state played with these theatrics for some time. And I think the absence of video and film archives in Libya is not because necessarily the state only forbid that, which is a whole other topic that we can go through another time. But it's also because Italy banned accessing the archives around the colonies until very, very recently. So also with the work that I reference a lot, the scholarly work of Dr. Ali Abdellatif Hameda is heavily reliant on the oral testimony as the main evidence that does not need to be packed by Western institutional way of narrating history. Yeah, and I think also with the poem and several other poems, there's always this questioning about the state of a future that is not yet to happen, or a future that is fractured, a temporality that is fractured, and the spatial dynamics that kind of repeats itself with the lack of understanding the past and how it can transform according to the political conditions of the time.
Thank you so much for this very thorough answer and reflection. Maybe we can, I have another point, but maybe we can, if anyone wants to, I can get back to it after. If anyone has any reflection they would love to share on the movie or on the notes, please feel free to do it now. And if not, I can. Okay, so maybe we can continue. I think just on what you mentioned about. So you're now based in Amsterdam, if I'm not mistaken, and I wanted to ask you to maybe elaborate a bit more on what it means to also bring all these processes and this work on sources to a context that is Western, and you hinted at it, that maybe some restrictions that can be caused by the context. how do you, how do you bring also this to life in a context that maybe is less familiar with also some, if we talk about you talked about Sufism a lot, about this cosmologies also, things that are necessary to bring, but maybe more difficultly understood in a context that is Western. Is it something that you deal with, or something that, yeah, if
Yes. So I finished this work very recently, actually, in around October, November last year. And I did screen it multiple times since then. And I've noticed something, for example, that although the institutions or spaces that were showing it were, you know, kind of had progressive politics, let's assume. But in the two times I've noticed that just the description and the synopsis of the film changed from being the first military airstrike to the first military airstrike in Libya, or being described as a counter history of military something. Although, you know, if you Google it, you find the information out there. And that was interesting because there are these subtleties of dismissal or the lack of knowledge that creates this assumption that, oh, we don't know, therefore it's complex. And that's something that I think a lot of also artists from Libya would probably face as well, like the question of the manufactured complexity in that sense. And in this case, with my approach kind of leaning more towards the embodied, with the support of the archival process along the way, and using this narration that is between the documentary, between the research and the fiction, it kind of, for me, puts like a layer where these voices have not much to say around our own narrative and the build-up of this narrative. Yes, because as you also mentioned, the question of the West and how, what does it mean to produce in the West around such topics. Yeah, there's these layers of we don't understand, therefore we can't actually even give an approval if this is the correct narration or not. One conversation I had recently was with a publisher who was an Italian publisher who was trying to translate the book that I reference of Ali Abdelatif Hameda to Italian. And what he faced within Italy, that all these Italian historians and academics collectively agreed that the book is an original because it lacks actual evidence. So the question of evidence, the question of archives, as soon as you use archives, there's an expectation to follow up with these archives and deconstruct them and unpack them and work around the archive in an expanded form. While I think the archive can be a multiplicity of a lot of layers, it can be mediated through these video games that were manufactured as a simulation, that through also the poetry, through the aestheticization, yeah, the image that is manufactured around the Sahara, around crossing the Mediterranean, they all kind of get entangled together in the process of working on this. So I think whenever I'm working also here and thinking that, okay, this is a work that I'm most of the time going to be showing here, it's also knowing that all these layers and multiplicities have to be put together in a way without necessarily compromising on a certain, you know, angle or perspective.
Yeah, so we have a question in the chat that I'll read, but you can read it. So thank you so much for the incredible presentation. I wonder what methods you use to engage with erased or missing archives, Is there a work of imagination and fiction you engaged with? I'm also wondering, how do you continue the research in a position of displacement between Libya and the Netherlands? And a third question, could you expand more on the quote you ended the presentation with on ghosts and justice? So if feel free to engage with these three questions, please.
Yes. Yeah, I think with the first question, this is, I think, with the missing archives and also the manipulation of archives, the inaccessibility to have easy access to it as well. And I think it's also my own idea about how do we use image and what does it mean to reproduce images in such contexts. If we're speaking of genocidal history and narrations that are deliberately, constantly have been under erasure. I mentioned that we're not only tracing the erasure, but the cycles of the erasure and erasure events. So that's why I think I'm using also like, rendered visuals, depictions of something without being too literal about it. And going also from the footage to the game or the film that is staged from, for example, Omar al-Mukhtar to other Italian archives, but I wouldn't want to work with the Italian archives as the main source material. For example, I think what I would love to do in my practice is to find ways in which I can subvert the colonial spectacle that is often found in the archive. You see a lot of images of the horse riders, the Sufi fighters, and against the backdrop, for example, of the palm tree with the Nazi, that was associated with Nazi Germany in World War II, and that was also some of the images from the colonial archives. So there's always kind of this back and forth that I like working with and creating tension in between it. In terms of imagination and fiction, I can't think of a word now like in the spot. But I think the idea of documentary fiction and research-based fiction is also how do you, for me, it's about how do we create alternative and counter narrations to how history has been written, and to that continuum of a future that is not happening or disrupted. Within also being between Libya and the Netherlands, I mean, I don't know how to answer that. It's a lot of hustling, honestly. But with the oral literature, with the more embodied inherited generational knowledge, I think it can offer a space and a site that creates fugitivity beyond the displacement that we have to go through. And I think the quote itself about ghosts and justice is that, the ghosts here are not only, of course, of the survivors in this context of the film, but I like how Haytham al-Wardani puts it, which is a text I really recommend to read, which related to, he wrote about the genocide happening in Gaza, and then he makes also a lot of these comparisons between who is the ghost, who are the dead, and who are people that are alive. And I think with the questions around the trial that I end the film with, it kind of assumes this positionality that the winds and the survivors and their animals and the species that were all victims to that genocidal fascist regime are not ghosts of the past, but also able to kind of contribute to some sense of justice or accountability in multiple ways of how we would think of some remnants of justice.
Thank you so much. Dr. Aya, if you would wish to conclude, I don't know how we are on time, but
I think we're not looking at time. I feel it's been a very interesting presentation and discussion. Thank you so much, Tewa, for all the generosity and responding to all of these questions and the work. I've learned a lot by looking at it. I took so many notes myself, and I feel like this has been a great learning opportunity that you enabled. So thank you so much for that. Maybe just like lastly, I don't know if you've come across this as you were speaking, because I just like had to do myself to push myself through the day with a cup of coffee. But my question is, how do you situate? Because this is a trilogy, right? So why this one for the Specters of the Undercommons? But also, how does this sit with the trilogy that you've got? And I think this is one of the comments that we also came back to you, like with the reviewers that looked at your work earlier.
Yes, true. So I submitted this because it's the first part of the trilogy, and the other two are still in progress. So this is the one that is, let's say, finalized. And also because I think for me, I thought also like, oh, it seems like an academic conference. Should I submit this or not? And I was like, actually, the work itself is a mode of theorizing, intellectualizing, connecting the dots together, mapping history and future and present realities. So in that sense, because this is the first part of the trilogy, and I'm continuing also with more layers that are focused on the relationship between the military and the game industry, with other games simulations and archival footage that I've been collecting and working on in the past years. Within the conference as well, because I think whenever Libya is also discussed within, any discourses within the Arab world or Africa, it's either not there or lacking context. So there's something very interesting to go back into the colonial times and to start from there. And I think that creates this dynamic of understanding what is going on now and how things have evolved in general. I mentioned a lot this relationship that I would like to investigate further in my work around the parallels and the infrastructures between the concentration camps then and the entire detention industry that is in Libya at the moment. So I think once we try to unpack the spatial, all of the spatial layers of Libya and its connection to Africa and the Mediterranean in general, it begins for me with also the creation of these concentration camps and the untreated wounds, the inability for a lot of years, because I think until 2011, a lot of what we're doing today was not possible, and it's still not possible in like the easy way of how things can be discussed and how knowledge can be produced. But there's a lot to learn there, and I think it's also for me like a lot of it's a learning curve as well, because for a lot of time this history was very much overshadowed by just the local colonial tyranny and other things happening.
No, but also was furious also at this connection between Ghibli Winds and
Oh yes,
oh
it's
my,
crazy. It's crazy.
that really got on my nerves as an information, just like also I always say like courage, like sometimes to confront the world with its own truth needs so much courage. So I can imagine like also realizing this with all the admiration that we have for really like films and uh, so yeah, so I thought that was quite yeah.
Yes,
So
yes,
I on the questions of stealing imaginations, I think it's pretty interesting to see how now it has been also in terms of colonial geographies spanning to Japan is it's yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we always forget that Japan is a very hardcore colonial empire.
Because their soft power was successful.
Yes, exactly. And I think I don't know if it slipped for him that the Ghibli is named after the wind, but there is this love and fascination with aircrafts in most of his films, and I really love Ghibli films, but it keeps coming back, and it's interesting to see it in this context where the attempt to rob the wind out of its context continued elsewhere in a way that was not how it would have been if there was more accountability after the fall of fascism, the so-called fall of fascism.
But I think it's also about what you mentioned earlier on the question of the voices and on how like what is a voice and what is a noise, and also on how Western imagination was in this case Ghibli movies work on also creating this the separate like on this whole system of imaginations of categorizing on voices, and how even if it slipped from him for him, it's also very representative of a categorized world of which voices are real voices and which one should be only like symbols of under names, I think.
Indeed.
I need to thank Emma as well for this brilliant engagement and for so many aspects of the film as well, like were brought to my attention, I must say, by Emma. So so thank you, Emma, for that great work.